We start by just saying just a few words about yourself, just an introduction to you, and then go on to 5 minutes or so about the report. So that if we could start off like that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Right. Yes, so I'm Dr. Malcolm Morgan. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute for Transport Studies in Leeds. I'm a civil engineer by original training, but my research is focused on, I use a lot of geospatial methods and GIS to look at decarbonisation and energy demand in transport and sort of urban sector. And I've been working at Leeds now for about 7 years. Doing this kind of stuff. So the report itself was called Uncut, Understanding Changing Car Use Over Time, and although we largely focused on car ownership because of some of the limitations of the data that we had. And what we were trying to understand were places where car ownership was in decline and whether there were any lessons to be drawn from that could be generalized or scaled up as a way of reducing overall car ownership and use and leading to decarbonisation of the transport sector. So my sort of motivation for looking into this was that it's been well known for a long time that car ownership is lower in inner cities and increases as you go out to the suburbs and then out to rural areas. And that's fine, we've known that. But the solution for, say, rural areas isn't to turn them into inner cities. So it's an observation of something that is true, but it's not a guide to how we could fix it. So I was interested, well, could we find, say, some suburbs or some rural areas where car use and ownership were declining? Because that might then suggest some change that we could make to other places that would reduce car ownership. And I managed to get from the Department of Transport some very locally specific data on car ownership over a long time period, almost 20 years. And so I had a quick look at this data and I thought, well, there's something there. There's some changes occurring, but I wanted to really dig into that data in more detail and see if there was anything useful in the data. And so I applied to the Decarbonate Seed Corn Fund for a little bit of money to give me a bit of time to sort of really dig into this data and to see if there was anything useful in it. So it was something of a data exploration project rather than having a concrete sort of research question to answer. But we were looking for this idea of places where car ownership was in decline. And we found a sort of bunch of sort of fairly interesting things. So the national trend is that car ownership is increasing. But when you break it down at a local level, you find lots of different patterns going on. So in big urban areas, so I think things like the centre of London, centre of Birmingham, car ownership has been fluctuating, but has largely been flat over the last 20 years. And almost all the growth in car ownership is occurring in the suburbs and rural areas. So it's not just that car ownership is higher in rural areas, it's growing in rural areas, and in cities it's stagnating, or in a lot of places slightly declining. And so that, that's interesting. It doesn't tell us why, but that divergence is occurring is interesting. And we also looked at various sort of geodemographic groups. So this is sort of clustering places by their physical characteristics, but also their populations. And sort of unsurprisingly, you see groups. There's a cluster called cosmopolitan student neighborhoods. And as you can imagine, students are quite a low car owning group, and so their car ownership in those areas is low and declining. But there's another group called struggling renters, who are also one of the lowest car ownership groups, but they're growing. And so that's interesting. That says something about car dependence, and people who are on low incomes are being forced into greater car ownership or choosing greater car ownership. We don't know from this data, but there are diverging trends going on. And so what I did was I sort of did some statistical methods to pass over these many thousands of areas and categorize the ones. And what I was really interested in places where the number of cars per person were in decline. And the reason I wanted to look at cars per person was if you just looked at number of cars, it might have been the reason that the number of cars declined was there was a housing estate and then it was demolished. And so all the people went and they took their cars with them. But that's not generalizable. We can't just demolish everyone's houses as a solution to climate change. So I wanted to look at places where in some way it suggested that the people were choosing to get rid of their cars. And there weren't many of them. Of the 35,000 roughly LSOAs in England and Wales, only about 200 seem to have this characteristic of declining car ownership per person. And then I used satellite photography from Google Earth, which has a really handy feature that lets you just sort of run a little slider back through time and view different years of satellite photography to try and look for changes in these areas. And so I spent a long time just flicking backwards and forwards between different photographs, trying to go, what was different? And the short answer to what we found was the best way to reduce car ownership is to build dense housing in existing urban areas. So we found lots of examples where new blocks of flats had gone in, or not necessarily high rise, but things like low rise flats and terraced housing, that kind of thing's fairly dense, in an existing urban area, increase the population without increasing the number of cars, and in some cases decreasing the number of cars. And we saw that could also happen to a lesser extent in suburban areas. But always sort of a doubling down on places that already work, somewhere where you could get to work or you could get to the shops without a car. And so putting more people into those kinds of areas, it seems that they don't bring their cars with them. We also saw examples sort of new housing estates that were on the face of it quite car dominated. So if you have a sort of little look around on the satellite photos or Google Street View and things, you'd see a lot of cars and it looked like quite a car dominated place. But they're also quite dense. A lot of these places they maybe didn't have garages. They just had a single car parking space in front of each home. And because of that, there seemed to be a sort of soft limit of one car per household. And those kinds of housing, they didn't reduce car ownership, but they maintained car ownership at a below average rate. So again, this sort of example of the type of housing, where it is, how it's built, being really influential on the rate of car ownership. And then the last thing we did is we looked at changing car ownership around new train and tram stations. The idea being there's a significant improvement in public transport, and that might persuade people to get rid of their car. And that was a really mixed picture. In dense inner city areas where car ownership was already low, we saw declines in car ownership after the stations opened, although it wasn't entirely clear whether the station opening was the cause of that, because in several cases the decline had occurred before the stations opened, but that could have been sort of preemptive or anticipatory. You know, if you know a new station is going to open in a location soon, a developer might start choosing to build boxer flats. And so we didn't have enough time to unpack exactly what was going on, but certainly some declines associated with new stations. But in other areas, particularly in sort of rural areas, it seemed to make no difference at all, and that the car ownership was increasing and continued to increase after the stations opened. So a really kind of mixed picture there, but quite interesting in terms of lessons about whether improving public transport is a solution to getting people out of their cars. And it seemed from this very initial analysis of this data that urban planning and home densities and things are much more strongly related with changes in ownership of cars than transport policies, which I found very interesting and something I'd like to explore more in the future.
A few things in there, immediate questions. One is that from what you said there, and also from my reading of the report, and painting it in a very simple way, basically make it difficult to park and you get a lower car density. It seems that, you know, that you should say if you build modern houses with just one drive space, then that tends to mean you're limited to one car. It's harder to park somewhere else. In the sort of denser urban areas you were talking about, there was even lower car density. So it did seem to me that there was a sort of a clear message, or am I being too simplistic there? A clear message to planners that the denser it is, and the harder it is to park, the less car ownership you will have.
I think you're right. I'm a little cautious because the way we did this is very difficult to establish causality. So to say that like the things we observed definitely caused the changes in car ownership, and there are some other limitations with the data. So one of the frustrating things with the data we had is we couldn't distinguish between private cars and company cars. And so that there were some odd things we saw where what it looked like is a business had moved and taken lots of cars with it, and that kind of stuff sort of messed up our statistics in a way that we couldn't really filter out nicely. But it definitely seems that like the more sort of anti-car policies, like removing parking, were more effective than the kind of pro alternatives like better public transport or better walking and cycling infrastructure. And so in reality, you probably want a mix of both. But yeah, from what we found, I'd be quite pessimistic that just say building lots of alternatives to the car would actually be particularly effective at reducing car ownership, certainly to the amount that we need to meet climate targets.
I mean, I think that's a true story that we're reluctant to get, or we're reluctant to take in many areas, that providing alternatives is never enough. It's an essential part of making changes, but you've got to somehow close down the incumbents. And we've found that with energy. You know, we put in renewable power, but we just use as much oil and gas. We now use renewable power as well as oil and gas, and so you've got to somehow close down the incumbents as well as provide those alternatives, which seems to be or at least it's one way you could read the observational findings that you have from your report. Thinking about how we can reduce ownership, not just because of the usage, but actually because of the materials in their production, is presumably that's quite a useful thing to be doing as well. I know some of the other work that's gone on in Leeds looking at things like rental schemes on the outskirts of cities or suburban areas. So perhaps your work can help fit into some of that.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot going on. So we've got another project that's just starting, funded by Administrative Data Research UK, and we've partnered with the Department of Transport. And what we're doing there is, so it's sort of the similar data, but coming from another angle, and we're trying to link the car registration data to the MOT history. And so every year you have to take your car for an MOT. And one of the things they record with that is what how much miles you've driven on the odometer. And so if you can compare this year's MOT with last year's MOT, you know how much they've driven per year. And then if we can link that car to a registered keeper in a specific location, doing that once for one person doesn't tell you much very interesting, but if we can do it for every car and do that over time, we can build up sort of records of average mileage per year per LSOA, and that would give us an idea of how usage is changing over time. And so that project has just started, and there are lots of complications with linking all these big complicated data sets together, but the hope is within sort of 2 or 3 years time we might be able to publish data which gives you sort of, people on this street drive an average of so many miles per year, and that has increased 5% over the last decade or something. And so then we could go back and look at things like train stations and go, oh, car ownership didn't change very much, but car use did change substantially.
Yeah.
And then to your point about the emissions and things from building the cars and the benefit of less cars, even if they're used less, I see it as a bit of a two-stage thing. If somebody's using a car every single day, there's always going to be a strong economic case to actually own that car, because if you're renting that car or car sharing it, you're going to hit sort of inconvenience and cost because of that. So there's an aspect of you need to get car use down to a level where you're not using it all the time, and then it's quite compelling for people to say, well, rather than having all these sort of fixed costs of owning a car, offload those to a shared car of some model, and that reduces your money. But because you have access to a car whenever you need, you don't have to worry about the fact that you don't own a car. And I think a lot of people, they own a car because there's that one journey a month or a year that they really need the car. You know, you can think of things like, oh, I need the big SUV because I tow the caravan up to the Lake District once a year. And then because they have the car and it's on the drive and it's easy, they then choose to drive to work every day. And so to get them into a state where they don't own that car, you would have to say, well, you're not going to drive to work every day. You're going to use the bus or the train or cycle or whatever the alternative is for that person in that situation. And then you can still go on your camping holiday, because I can guarantee you there's the right kind of car share car just around the corner. You can have it whenever you want.
Yes.
And that's how you get to like the no car state. But if you tell people, you know, oh, you just can't have your car, they'll go, well, I need it for work, and you'll never get to that real reason about the annual camping holiday.
Where do you hope to go from this with this business? Do you have any plans of where you can take it next?
So the short term is the CARS project and linking up this MOT data to get the usage, because that I think will add a large amount of nuance. It's also likely that we will get more about ownership. So what we had was just a number of cars, no other contextual information. So it would be nice to break that down into types of car, fuel type as well. You know, where are the EVs, where are the petrol cars, size of car, you know, SUVs, and unpack all of that in a lot more detail. And yeah, over the next sort of year or so, hopefully we will get that data when we'll start to produce the analysis. And the hope is we will take the first crack at doing the analysis and publishing the results. But the hope is that eventually that this might turn into an open data set that's available to all researchers, and may even become something that the Department of Transport takes over and starts publishing annually long into the future. And so that would be a big step up in the quality of the sort of small area data we have about transport. And then, as I mentioned, I want to link that with as many contextual data sets as possible. So I'm working on a bit of a side project looking at historical public transport timetables to see if we could start to say, well, like, what's the frequency of the bus service on this street and how has it changed over the last 20 years? Because I suspect some of the reason we see sort of improvements in urban areas, or decreases in car ownership, are related to better public transport, but not necessarily new, like harder infrastructure. It's just like they've changed the timetables and the bus runs twice as frequently, or it runs for a longer period of the day. And capturing those variations in time, but also in place, I suspect will explain a lot. So, for example, if you look at London, inner London has about one car for every 7 people, whereas in Leeds, it's more like one car for every 2 people. Yeah. So, you know, there's a reason for that. And then if you try and measure the frequency of public transport, or the connectivity by public transport, the worst connected places in London are better connected by public transport than the best connected places anywhere outside London.